I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. There were more than 7,100 new confirmed COVID-19 cases nationwide Sunday, bringing Canada's total reported case count since the pandemic began to over 1.23 million. The national death toll sits at 24,300. The hotspots continue to be Ontario, Alberta, and Quebec. Ontario logged over 3,700 new infections, and Alberta more than 1,700, with Quebec logging just over 1,000. Yukon reported no new cases Sunday, but Northwest Territories had one, and there were another 11 reported in Nunavut's current outbreak. The first waves of the pandemic devastated seniors, but new Health Canada data suggests the third wave is hitting people under the age of 60. That's due to high vaccination rates among seniors and more infectious variants of COVID-19. The number of people over 70 who died between March 26th and April 23rd fell more than 77% from peak levels of the second wave. But hospitalizations for Canadians in their 40s increased by 65%, and hospitalizations of people in their 20s and 30s rose 40%. More than 2 million doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine are set to start arriving in the country on a weekly basis. They will now be coming from Pfizer's plant in Kalamazoo, Michigan, but it's still not clear when the U.S. will free up doses of the in-demand Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which is now being given to people 40 and older in several provinces. The Pfizer-BioNTech doses are the only shots scheduled for arrival in the next 7 days. The Port of Montreal has said it will take days to resume operations after the Senate passed legislation Friday, forcing over 1,100 striking dock workers back on the job. Workers walked off the job last Monday to push for a new contract with the Maritime Employers Association to replace one that expired in December 2018. Michael Murray, with the Canadian Union of Public Employees, calls the back-to-work legislation an attack on the workers' constitutional right to strike. Some sexual assault victims who testified at parliamentary committees in recent months say they felt angered and in some cases re-victimized by their experience. Julie Lalonde, a sexual violence prevention educator, says she was disturbed by the way other women who were sharing deeply personal stories of sexual assault were continually cut off for time by MPs during their testimony. Questions are now being raised about whether Canada's lawmakers should be trained in how to take a more trauma-informed approach to their interactions with vulnerable witnesses. Public health experts are calling for urgent action after a scathing assessment of Ontario's long-term care sector. The call comes after Ontario's Long-Term Care Commission released a report on the province's pandemic response in long-term care homes, where more than 4,000 virus-related deaths occurred. The blistering 322-page document says the sector is in desperate need of an overhaul, adding that the province was ill-prepared to face COVID-19, despite lessons it should have learned from SARS in 2003. Advocates are calling on the federal government to address anti-Black racism in the public service by implementing timely changes. The Public Service Alliance of Canada says anti-Black racism in the federal public service is widespread, and there are limited opportunities for career growth or advancement for Black employees. The Professional Institute of Public Service of Canada's Executive Vice President, Norma Domi, says she is the first Black executive in her institute's 100-year history. Well, because they're considered freelancers, the federal government has told interpreters that they don't qualify for sick pay. Members of the International Association of Conference Interpreters also recently learned that they won't get paid if they need to isolate or quarantine because of COVID-19. The interpreters say the government's policy is tone-deaf, and members are upset because they must work on Parliament Hill, putting them at risk of getting the virus. Well, it has been a challenging year for college and university students who are now facing the prospect of not being able to find a summer job. University of Calgary Students' Union President Frank Finley expects it will be a repeat of last summer, when more than a third of Calgary students didn't find any work and worried about dropping out or being homeless. The Canadian Alliance of Student Associations is hearing the same message from students right across the country. Canadians appear to be seeing strange things as they scan the night skies in increasing numbers during the pandemic. That's led to a growing interest in astronomy and unusual calls to RCMP 911 dispatchers. Tracy Duvall, acting operations manager in Red Deer, Alberta, says the province's dispatch centers received nearly 900,000 calls last year. Winnipeg-based ufology research released a survey in March that said unexplained sightings across Canada increased by 46% in 2020. All right, coming up on our Week in Review, we discussed Canada's membership in NATO and the importance of this alliance to the country. We spoke with Mr. Christian Leuprecht, professor at the Royal Military College and Queen's University and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Stay tuned for this interview and more national and international news after the break on the Forum Daily. Stay with us. Canada's membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has been brought into question during the pandemic, as some experts claim NATO should have been disbanded years ago following the end of the Soviet Union. However, NATO has expanded from its original designation to become an international military alliance that has grown its membership since its founding in the mid-1900s. Tamara Lawrence from Balsillie School of International Affairs claims NATO's expansion is directly related to American weapons giant Lockheed Martin, who used the growing influence to promote American weapons sales in European countries. Ms. Lawrence argues that NATO continues to be a key player in promoting international defense spending on American weapons. However, Professor Christian Leuprecht from Queen's University argues that NATO has a much larger role to play in the international community. To talk more on the importance of NATO and why Canada should maintain its membership, we are joined by Mr. Christian Leuprecht, professor at the Royal Military College and Queen's University and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Welcome back to Forum Daily, sir.
Hello, my pleasure.
So, what was the original purpose of the NATO alliance in the mid-1900s?
Summed up by its first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. So to contain and deter Soviet aggression and expansionism, to ensure that the United States would get entangled lines, which the U.S. had resisted for decades, in order to preserve and have that deterrent effect, and to make sure you preserve stability on the European continent after a good 30 years of war between 1914 and 1945.
And how has that designation evolved over the years to become the NATO that we know now?
So we have an organization that has endured and that is arguably the most powerful military alliance the world has ever known. And that suggests that democracy needs to be defended. It cannot just be taken for granted, whether that's stability in the Balkans, whether that's anti-terrorism and counterinsurgency missions, advise and assist missions to help countries rebuild their own institutions and their stability, or to contain revisionist powers such as Russia and China.
So what kind of role has Canada played in NATO in particular over the years?
Well, it turns out that NATO was actually in many ways a Canadian idea. We can see this in Article where we see that NATO is not just a military alliance, it is first and foremost a political alliance of like-minded countries who believe that there are certain values and certain ways of running their own political systems and running the world that are simply better for humanity and that provide greater stability, and that those values, NATO is ultimately what NATO represents.
Now, I want to touch on Ms. Lawrence's point. She argues that NATO plays a key role in the sale of American weapons to international players. So is this true, and what kind of benefits does this role play for Canada?
Well, deterrence also means that you need to have very advanced military kit, and that tends to be extremely expensive to develop. And so inherently, the United States, being the largest member, has capacities to develop such technology that other allies simply don't have, but to which they can contribute. And so being part of an alliance means that we benefit from the collective expenditures. It means that Canada overall spends less on defense than it would if it would not be part of NATO, and have that money available to spend on other things that are important to Canadians. So it actually provides us a discount on defense to be able to be part of an alliance.
About a minute and a half left, sir, but I guess the big question here is, why does Canada need to continue to invest in its military and NATO during the pandemic and beyond?
Well, we live in a very dangerous world. You can argue that we live in the most contested times that we have seen in decades. If we look at the efforts by powers such as Russia, China, also Iran, North Korea, the weapons that are the North American continent, hypersonic missiles in particular, underwater autonomous vehicles that Russia and China have been developing. And if you look at the challenges for our military domestically, in terms of domestic operations, forest fires, floods due to climate change, helping with biosecurity events such as the pandemic, the military has never been more important than it is today.
All right, sir, just under a minute, but what would be the consequences if Canada were to leave NATO?
NATO is Canada's single most important multilateral institution. It allows us to leverage our interests through allies in the ways that otherwise we would be a little country caught in between three seas on the North American continent, disproportionately reliant on the United States. And so NATO has been absolutely vital to asserting Canada's interests across the world.
All right, Mr. Luprecht, thank you again for your insight on Forum Daily. Always great having you on the show, sir.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
After the break, this past week, Canadians heard contradicting information from NACI on vaccines as new recommendations were shared with the country. We spoke with Dr. Abhishek Raut from Appletree Medical Group in our weekly TIA Health Update. The story and more coming up on the Forum Daily Week in Review. The National Advisory Committee on Immunization is being criticized after contradicting the advice Canadians have been receiving for weeks to take the first COVID-19 vaccine they're offered. NACI said Monday that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are preferred and Canadians should weigh the risks of waiting for one of them before deciding whether to take a more immediate jab of the other two approved for use in Canada. The AstraZeneca and the single-dose Johnson & Johnson vaccines have been linked to an extremely rare blood clotting syndrome. Meanwhile, some Canadians who got the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID-19 shot are posting on social media that they feel they've been tricked into getting a second-rate vaccine. This comes as officials in Ontario look to NACI for advice on mixing vaccine doses for patients, as the province is expecting millions of Pfizer-BioNTech doses in the coming weeks, but supply of other vaccines is less certain. Well, to help us take a deeper look at these new recommendations in our TIA Health Medical segment, we are joined by Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Appletree Medical Group. Welcome back to Forum Daily, sir.
Thanks for having me.
So what would you say are the main takeaways from NACI's announcement on Monday, sir?
Well, so basically, NACI has doubled down on this position that Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna are preferred. And Johnson & Johnson AstraZeneca vaccines, they're asking Canadians to kind of weigh the risks. This is very different than the general messaging we've had in Canada up to this date, which is to take the first vaccine available to you. So as you can expect, many Canadian doctors very surprised by this change in medicine.
And why do you think NACI has walked back on these recommendations that they had promoted for months now?
That's interesting. So NACI is a national advisory committee of experts in pediatrics, epidemiology, immunology, and pharmacoeconomics. So NACI has been providing one job in Canada, which is to provide the most expert advice on vaccines we've had. And they've been doing this since 1964. So as new information comes in, just like the viral vector vaccines information, there is some concern with safety. And so NACI, I think correctly, had to look at that and say that the vaccines are showing some are more safe than the others and would push towards those.
So how should Canadians who have already gotten the AstraZeneca shot react to this information, Dr. Raut?
I think that's a very good question. So the concerns on the viral vector vaccines, of course, is the increased risk of blood clots for certain populations. As always, I'd recommend that anyone who's received those vaccines to just take a note of any side effects they're experiencing with them. I think it's confusing on how to proceed right now. I think the first dose of AstraZeneca, if you already received it, the question is, do you now go to the second dose or do you switch back to Pfizer or Moderna? And I don't think we have the answer yet, but hopefully in the coming weeks.
And for these particular Canadians, how can they identify if the side effects they experience from this vaccine are regular side effects or more serious, such as blood clots?
Right. So a lot of the vaccines have very similar side effects: tiredness, headache, muscle pain, nausea, fevers, chills. The concerning symptoms are breathlessness, chest pain or stomach pain, swelling or coldness in the leg, and a very severe headache. And if you see any signs of bleeding or bruising, that's another concern as well.
And now we have officials in Ontario looking into mixing different vaccine shots. They're referring to NACI for this information as well. So what do we know so far about the success of this particular method, Dr. Raut?
Right. So this is interesting to me. To look at mix and match for vaccines, we have to look at two things, which is really safety and efficacy. preliminary evidence so far that we're not going to see too much in terms of difference in safety than if you receive them separately. But the efficacy question is interesting. In animal models, we actually have seen that mixing and matching gives you better protection than just a single one. And we actually do mix and match other vaccines like pneumonia vaccines. We use Prevnar 13 and switched to Pneumovax 23. So the question really is, how does this translate into COVID vaccines? And I think we're going to have to wait on the experts for that.
Now, considering that NACI has walked back on something they sounded very confident about a few weeks ago, what does that say about this organization's credibility, Dr. Rout?
Yeah, so what I can say is when you have a new pandemic with a new disease which rapidly mutates, it's not uncommon to see a difference of opinion between experts. And this difference is healthy because each side usually does have a point. And as always, we have to look at those risks and benefits. While I'm surprised about NACI's change, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think what NACI is showing is it's still very rooted in expert-based medicine, and which is very important to what we need right now.
All right, Dr. Rout, about 30 seconds left, but what are some other credible sources of vaccine information that Canadians can refer to?
Right. So regardless of what has happened with NACI, for sure, I would recommend that Canadians always look at a multitude of credible sources. The big ones that I would recommend, aside from NACI, are the Center for Disease Control, the WHO, and Johns Hopkins School of Public Health Coronavirus Resource Center.
All right, Dr. Rout, thank you again for joining us on Forum Daily, and we'll see you again next week. All right, don't go away. We'll be right back after the break with top international stories from this past week on the Forum Daily Week in Review. Don't go away. More when we return. India's government that is facing calls for a strict lockdown to slow a devastating surge in coronavirus infections has been ordered by the Supreme Court to submit a plan to meet New Delhi hospitals' oxygen needs within a day. The court decided against immediately punishing officials for failing to end the supply problems. A massive wave of infections since April has pushed India's healthcare system to the brink. The European Union is letting the United States, Canada, and Norway join a major military project aimed at speeding up the deployment of troops and equipment around Europe. The project is led by the Netherlands and aims at easing bureaucratic procedures that slow the deployment of troops. More than 70,000 U.S. military personnel are stationed in Europe, partly to deter aggression from Russia. Canada is leading a NATO battle group stationed in the region near Russia's border, and Norway is involved as well. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has met with his Ukrainian counterpart in Kyiv and said he was there to reaffirm strongly Washington's commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. Ukrainians hold strong hopes for the visit, including increased military aid and strong support for NATO membership. By visiting so early in his tenure, before any trip to Russia, Mr. Blinken is signaling that Ukraine is a high foreign policy priority for President Joe Biden's administration. European Union defense ministers are discussing plans for a military training mission in Mozambique in the coming months. The aim is to help the government in the southern African country take control of northern regions held by extremist rebels. The UN World Food Programme says over 950,000 people are in urgent need of food aid. EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell says Mozambique's government has requested help. The EU has been helping to train Mali's army and rebuild its defense institutions with a non-combat mission since 2013. France's foreign minister is starting a visit to Lebanon with a message of great firmness to political leaders. In a tweet ahead of his arrival today, he said travel restrictions on Lebanese officials suspected of corruption or hindering the formation of a new cabinet were just the start. Le Drian is expected to meet with top Lebanese leaders to discuss a months-long political deadlock that has accelerated the small country's economic and financial demise. Prominent pro-democracy activist Joshua Wong has been sentenced to more jail time for participating in an unauthorized vigil to commemorate the 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown. For years, Hong Kong was the only place in China where people were allowed to mark the anniversary of Beijing's crushing of the Chinese democracy movement. It was banned last year, but thousands of people defied it. Mr. Wong and 3 district councillors pleaded guilty to knowingly taking part in the unauthorized vigil. At least 155 million people faced acute hunger in 2020, and the outlook for 2021 is equally grim or worse, according to a report by 16 organizations. The report, which focuses on 55 countries that account for 97% of humanitarian assistance, said the magnitude and severity of food crisis last year worsened as a result of conflicts, the economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic, and weather extremes that exacerbated pre-existing fragilities. 155 million people faced crisis emergency or famine levels of food needs, an increase of around 20 million people from 2019. Peloton has gone reverse over its treadmills. The company is now recalling about 125,000 of its treadmills less than a month after insisting they were safe and that they wouldn't be pulled off the market. The Peloton Tread Plus models came under scrutiny after being linked to the death of a child and the injuries of 29 others. Peloton now says it will offer full refunds for the Tread Plus, which costs more than $4,200. It will also stop selling them. SpaceX has launched and successfully landed its futuristic Starship. The full-scale stainless steel rocket ship blasted off from the southeastern tip of Texas yesterday in the company's latest test flight. It soared nearly 10 kilometers before flipping and descending horizontally. It went vertical again just in time for touchdown. The Guinness Book of World Records is looking into whether a new milestone has been set for living births at one time. It tells the Associated Press that its current record is 8 babies born at once, and it is working to verify the case in Morocco on Tuesday, when a woman from Mali gave birth to 9 surviving babies. Mali's Ministry of Health says the 25-year-old had only been expecting 7 newborns, but delivered non-uplets by cesarean section. All are said to be doing well. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news from this past week. For more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media channels on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for updates. You could also watch all of our news and commentary programming on the News Forum YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next time. Take care, everyone.